Guys, so before we start our third method of solving systems with a quadratic and linear equation, you need to realize a couple of things. First, be ready to learn right now. And so having your earbuds in, you're not ready to learn. Having your phone in your lap, not ready to learn. Make sure you have a pencil and you have your notes. So first thing I'm going to talk about is when given, so most of what we're going to come to when we have to solve these systems is we're going to have two terms in our quadratic. Most of the time, how many terms do we have in our quadratic equation? How many terms do we normally have in our quadratic equation? Most of the time. When you had to factor, when you had to put it into the quadratic formula, how many terms did we have? If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's really sad because we've been working with these quadratics. We worked with them with our last test, 2B, and we've been working with them for the past couple of days. So think about your quiz. How many terms was in when you had an x squared in the equation? How many terms were there? There were 3 terms. You have an x squared term, you have an x term, and you have a term without an x. Okay? So like it's called a constant or just a number. So there's usually 3 terms. And so we would factor them, okay, into 2 binomials. Well, today we're going to be dealing with a lot that just have 2 factors. So the most basic one how would I factor x squared minus x? Well, you actually did this way back in Algebra 1, and it was called factoring out a monomial. What's mono mean? 1. So you're factoring out one thing. Or we would say the GCF. We're going to factor out the GCF. What's the greatest common factor for x squared and x? It's x. Oh, no, where I'm doing it on a piece of paper. Basically what I'm doing is I'm dividing. I'm going to divide both of these terms by x. So x goes into x squared how many times? So what times what's going to give me x squared, in other words? X. X times what's going to give me negative x? Negative 1. Okay? So think of it. So if I'm taking out this x or I'm factoring out the x, then I'm going to say, okay, x times what gives me x squared? X, so that's an x. X times what gives me negative x? Negative 1. Alright, so this is factored, guys. This is factored. We still have 2 factors, okay? We have factor number 1, and then we have factor number 2. So we still have 2 factors, okay? Alright, another way to do this is if we have numbers in front, and we could. So if we have something like 5x squared plus 30x. What's the greatest common factor? Great. What's the greatest common factor between these two? And let me tell you real fast. How do I know that I'm looking for a greatest common factor? When you are down to 2 terms in a quadratic and they both have an x, most likely you can factor out a GCF, okay? So, what number can go in both 5 and 30?
6.
Nope, 6 can't go into 5. What? 5. 5 can go into 5, and 5 can go into 30 evenly. Alright, is that its only greatest common factor? What else do they have? X. They both have an X as well, don't they? So basically, 5x times what gives me 5x squared? 5x times what gives me 30x? And there's your two factors. If I would have, if this was set equal to 0, then I'd have to solve it, correct?
Oh.
So then I would say, okay, 5x equals 0, because that's one factor, and the other one would be x plus 6 is equal to 0. So x equals 5 times what gives me 0? 0. And what plus 6 gives me 0? Negative 6, right? Okay. So these would be my two solutions. Okay. Now today we're going to take those solutions and plug them back in to find our y, but we're not there right now. All right. So that's one way to factor it. The other way that we're going to factor today that you could is by square root method. The square root method. So that's when you're given, you usually have an x squared and minus a number. Let's say 16. Okay, equals 0. So notice this time I have two terms, but they don't both have an x, do they, this time? So we're going to use the square root method. This is something that some of you, you did pretty okay on your test. Some of you struggled on this part. Whenever it asks you to use the square root method, the goal is to get the x squared by itself. So how am I going to get x squared by itself? Yeah, add 16 to both sides. So I end up with x squared is equal to 16. Now, how am I going to solve just for x? Square root, because this x is being squared. We have to undo that, and so to undo squaring something, we find the square root. So those cancel each other out, x comes down. Now remember, when I square root something, it could be a positive or a negative, right? Everybody understand that? And what's the square root of 16? 4. So this would happen to be a perfect square, and I believe the ones that we're going to deal with will be perfect squares as well. If it wasn't a perfect square, it would just be the plus or minus the square root of whatever that number is, okay? Alright, are you okay with this, guys? I want to go over, because we're going to be using these a lot. So when you are given two terms in a quadratic, two ways you can look at factoring. Either one, you're going to find the GCF, or two, the square root method. When would you use the GCF method?
When it's not a perfect square.
When it's not, and what else? You have what? Each term has a what? X. You have x's, okay? You're going to use the square root method when you have an x squared and a number. Okay? Alright. Let's go to our notes now. Alright, so now we're going to use the elimination method. And there's 5 steps, but these steps are not as long as our substitution. So it's not going to be as painful as substitution was. Try to get me my...
So this school trying to kill me.
I'm sorry.
Can I go pour some this morning?
Not right now. Let's do this and then we'll have time. Okay, here we go. So, first step, well, before even the first step in every single method is the same. Each equation, let me see, how did I put it? But each equation starts with y equals. So we want to do that first, really. So there's actually kind of 6 steps. If both equations do not start with y equals, then you have to get it there. So as you can see, our first equation is not y equals, is it? So what are we going to have to do to this equation to get y by itself?
Subtract 2x.
Yeah, we would just subtract 2x. So it becomes y equals negative 2x minus 4. And I got that by subtracting 2x from both sides, okay? That's all. The other one we're good. So the top equation, if I were to graph it, what would it graph for me? What shape?
It'll obviously be a parabola.
Not the first one. The first one would be a line. The second one, on the other hand, would graph a parabola, which is U-shaped, okay? And the way you can tell the difference is if you look at the x, the highest exponent of the x. So in the first equation, we only have one x, and it's to the first power. It's a line. The second equation, we have a couple of x's here in the terms, but the highest exponent is to the second power. That will graph a parabola. So that's how we know. Alright, so step 1 says you want the same number but different signs for the coefficients of y. That's a big word, coefficient. What is a coefficient? Like the coefficient of y. What would that be? What would I be looking at? Well, that's what the different signs mean. We want it to be the opposite, you're right, but what's going to be the opposite? What does it mean by the coefficients have to be opposite? What are the coefficients of y? If I said 3y, what's the coefficient?
What, 3?
Coefficient's 3. It's the number being multiplied to the variable. Guys, x can have a coefficient, y can have a coefficient, a can have a coefficient. Whatever variable you're using has a coefficient. And that coefficient is the number being multiplied to it. Okay? That's all it is. So that's why it says it has to have the same number, different signs for the coefficient of y. Guys, our y's are always going to be 1. So always want it 1 and negative 1. Got it? So I'm going to rewrite these two equations down right here. Y equals negative 2x minus 4. And y equals 2x squared plus 4x minus 4. So right now, our whole goal is to eliminate one of the variables when we add the two equations together. So that's why one has to be positive, one has to be negative, so we can cancel them out. And they have to have the same coefficient. But we're looking at the y, so we want to eliminate the y's. So right now, if I were to add these two y's together, would that equal 0? Would they eliminate?
No.
No, right now they'd be 2y. So, to make one of our y's negative, we'd have to multiply the whole equation by negative 1. And I'm always going to do this with my linear equation. So I'm going to take the equation that's going to be a line, and I'm going to multiply this whole equation by negative 1. Okay? So it becomes negative y equals positive 2x plus 4. So everything became its opposite in this equation. because I multiplied it by -1.
Well, I thought the variables couldn't be
Well, but remember, we're trying to eliminate the variable. So we have to have one of them to be negative, okay? And then my other equation stays the same. I don't do anything to it. So it's just y equals 2x squared plus 4x minus 4. And so now what we have done, this was step 1. This is step 2. We lined up the equal sign and all the variables as best we could. So now we're at step 3. Alright, so step 3 is right here. Step 3, we are going to add the equations. Okay? Step 3, we're going to add the equations together. Basically combining like terms. Okay? So, what's -1y plus y? What is that going to give me?
0.
It's going to be 0. Because they're opposites, remember? When we add opposites together, it equals 0. Alright, this 2x squared, do I have anything to combine with 2x squared? No, so I'm just going to bring it down. 2x squared. Then I have 4x. Do I have anything to combine with 4x? I have 2x up here. 2x and 4x gives me plus 6x. And then the -4. Do I have anything to combine with -4? I have 4. What's going to happen with 4 and -4? They cancel out. So here's what we're left with. We are now on step 4. And step 4 says solve by factoring or quadratic formula. We're more going to be factoring. So all the ones that I've done so far, none of them have had to use the quadratic formula. Alright guys, how many terms do we have? I have 2 terms. 2x squared and 6x. So am I going to find the GCF or solve by the square root method? Look at the, if you wrote them down last time, look at the examples that we did at the beginning. Are we going to find the GCF between those 2 terms or use the square root method? What?
Square root method.
Alright, well, as I recall, we use the square root method when we have an x squared in a number. Do I have an x squared in a number? No, I have an x squared in an x, don't I?
Oh, so we're going to use the one.
We're going to use the GCF, okay? What's the greatest common factor between 2x squared and 6x? 2, just 2? 2x. Okay, so 2x times what gives me 2x squared? X. 2x times what gives me 6x? What? Yeah, it's 3. See guys, if I go back and multiply this out, it should give me what I started with, okay? Alright, there's my factors. So what it says to do now, so we haven't solved yet, have we? What do we have to do to solve?
We have to make them equal to 0.
Yeah, set each factor equal to 0. So 2x equals 0 and x plus 3 equals 0. What? 2 times what gives me 0? 0. And what plus 3 gives me 0? -3. It's the opposite. So now we have So we have two different answers for x. So we know that this parabola and this line intersect in two different places, okay? So we have to find those 2 points. So we're going to have to, we're going to step 5, substitute each number for x into any original equation. Which equation would you want to use, the first or the second? The first one. I would probably always use the linear equation, okay? So here's step 5. So y plus 2 times 0 equals negative 4. Well, 2 times 0 is 0. What is y plus 0?
Y.
It's just y. So y equals negative 4. Everybody agree? Alright, so we have our first point. Our first point is 0, negative 4. We're going to use that same equation, and now we're going to plug in negative 3 for x. So it's going to be y plus 2 times negative 3, whoops, sorry about that 3, is equal to negative 4. Well, 2 times negative 3 is, hold on, whoops, I made it. What's 2 times negative 3? Come here. There we go. It's negative 6. So I'd be minus 6 equals negative 4. So either you could do mental math here and just say, okay, what minus 6 gives me negative 4? Or we could add 6 to both sides, if you can't think of that mentally, and we get y is equal to, what's negative 4 plus 6? 2. So y equals 2. So my second point is negative 3, 2. So here are my 2 solutions for this system. This is Miss Sullivan. Yes, I can. You're welcome. Bye. Alright guys, so here we go. We're going to do all that all over again on example 7. What's wrong with example 7? Not wrong, but they're not in the form of y equals. Can you put your calculator away for me, please? Thanks.
I will, ma'am.
They're not in the form of y equals. So, can you guys, Oscar, Katie, can y'all tell me how to get y equals? Since y'all are chit-chatting over there. Something good has got to be going on. We're looking at example 7. And we notice that neither one of those equations are starting with y equals, okay? So we want to make them that way. So the first one, to make the first one y equals,
Wait, do we have to do that one? Or can we do the bottom?
we have to do both. Both of them have to be in the form of y equals, okay?
Oh, that's so bad.
Because it has to look like this. See how we were able to cancel our y's out and t equals 0? That's what we want to happen every time. So our first equation, we're going to add x squared and add 2x to both sides, okay? To finally get y is equal to x squared plus 2x plus 7. All I did is I took x squared and I added it, and I added 2x, okay? I made sure it stayed in this form, x squared, x, and the number. Has to stay like that. It's kind of like beginning your sentences with a capital letter. Alright, next, how am I going to get this linear equation into y equals? just add x to both sides. So it ends up being y equals x plus 7. Alright, can I just go ahead and add it? Look at our first example. Can I go ahead and just add this and get what I want and eliminate?
No, you gotta make one of them negative.
Yeah, I gotta make one of them negative. And I'm gonna tell you right now, the one you always want to make negative is the linear. So is that the first or the second equation?
Second.
That's the second. So we want to make that one negative. So we're gonna multiply by -1. So my top equation stays the same. The bottom one becomes -y equals -x minus 7. So this is step 1. Step 2. Now we're at step 3. Step 3 says to do what? We're going to add. So we're going to add these two together. Y plus a -y. 0 equals, we don't combine x squared with anything, so we just bring it down. 2x minus, or 2x plus a -x. Positive x, so it's a plus x. Because that's 2 plus a -1, which is +1. What happens to my 7s? They cancel. So we're back to just 2. I told you this is going to happen a lot. We're at 2 terms. So are we going to find the GCF to factor them, or are we going to solve by the square root method? GCF, because they both have an x in them, okay? What is the GCF for x squared and x? It's just x. Oh. X times what gives me x squared? X times what gives me x? 1. So we have factored it, but now we got to solve it. So I'm going to set each of them equal to 0. So we have x equals 0, and the other one, x plus 1 equals 0. What does x have to equal? Alright, so now I know what my x's are. I have two different x's. That means these two equations cross each other 2 different times, right? Now we have to find the y value so I can have my points of intersection. So I have to use one of my original equations. Which one should I use? First or the second? Second. It looks easier, right? It just looks easier. So let's use the second equation. And where I see x in the second equation, I'm going to plug in my x value. So first I'm going to have y minus, and instead of x, I'm going to put 0, equals 7. Well, what's y minus 0? It's just y. So y equals 7. That means my point is 0, 7, where they intersect. So there's one solution. The second one, it's going to be y minus a -1 equals 7. Before I solve this, what's minus a negative? You're adding. So y plus 1 equals 7. What plus 1 equals 7? 6. So my other point is -1, 6. So there's my two solutions. And let's do that one more time. Just to make sure you got it. Alright, so, look what they did for us on example 8.
Finally.
They're already both in y equals form, right? So we need to just figure out which one we want to make negative.
The linear.
The linear, which is which equation, first or second?
First.
The first. So we're going to take the first, and we're going to multiply this first one by -1. So we're going to get -y equals -x minus 2, right? And the second one's going to just be the same. Y equals x squared plus x plus 1. Now we're going to add them together. So my y is equals 0 like I want. X squared just comes down, has nothing to combine with. I have -x plus x. Those cancel out. I have no x's. But and then I have -2 plus 1. -1. Alright, so I've added. I've done step 3. I'm at step 4 where it says solve by factoring. How am I going to factor this one? Square root method this time. When I use the square root method, and why do I know I'm going to use the square root method this time? There's not an x in the second term. That's right. There's an x squared, but then the other term is a number. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to get x squared by itself. How do we do that? We're going to add 1 to both sides. Plus 1, plus 1. We get 1 equals x squared. Now what am I going to do? Square root both sides to get x by itself. So I have x is equal to, what's the square root of 1? Not just 1, it's positive and a -1, correct? So we have 2 answers. We have 2 values for x, guys. One's a positive one, one's a -1. Got it? So now we're going to have to choose one of the original equations to find our y's. Alright, so we're going to use the first one. Y equals, instead of x, I'm going to put positive 1 plus 2. What's 1 plus 2? Okay. So now there's one of my points. 1, 3. Alright, the next one is y equals, instead of positive 1, what am I going to put for x? Remember, x is positive 1 and -1 plus 2. What's -1 plus 2? 1, it's positive 1. So -1, 1 is my second point. Here are my solutions. Alright. So on your homework page, so it's the first page of your homework packet. You're going to do numbers 1, 3, and 5. 1, 3, and 5. It should be the last ones that you haven't done yet. 1, 3, and 5. Okay? And that is all.